We're going to talk now about the actual action potential. So this is the situation that we have in a resting potential. It's minus 70 millivolts, and that is the potential difference between the very positive number of ions on the outside with sodium and the potassiums that have leaked out of the potassium leak channel, and the potassiums which are inside the membrane. So here's our resting potential of minus 70. Sodiums and a few potassiums out, potassiums in. And what's going to happen is we're going to have stimulation. And what this stimulation is going to be is it's either going to be directly from a receptor, or it might be via a number of other neurons which come into a synapse and through a process of summation, which we'll talk about later, allow a certain number of sodium ions to leak into the axon. Now, when this happens, if sodium plus ions leak in to this axon, which has got a membrane potential of minus 70, then you'll see, and we can see from this graph, that the negativity of the membrane potential will actually decrease. And when I say that, it's going to go to minus what? To start with, minus 69, minus 68, as plus ions come in. Now at about minus 60, maybe minus 55, we hit what we call a threshold value, or threshold voltage. And this is where we start to have the action potential, because we bring in these other two proteins, which are going to form the basis of this shaped curve. So as these sodium ions leak in, as a result of stimulus or other neurons, we start to get towards this threshold potential. And then when we do hit around minus 60, minus 55, this voltage-gated sodium channel opens. And we call it voltage-gated because it will open and close at certain voltages. And when this opens at around, say, minus 60, minus 55, sodium ions are able to rush in down their concentration gradient and down an electrochemical gradient. Remember, it's loads of very positive up here, less positive down here. And so she's screaming, "No!" And they all rush down. As they do so, they make the inside of the axon more positive. So we go minus 60, minus 50, minus 40, minus 30, minus 20, minus 10, 0. Now that's the point at perhaps where you think, all right, we've equalised out and the second law is being adhered to. But because they're flooding in so quickly, it goes up and up. It goes past 0. It goes plus 10, plus 20, and probably to around plus 30 millivolts. So in a way, the sodium ions have gone down their concentration electrochemical gradient, but have overshot their mark. A bit like a pendulum that swings. If you allow a pendulum to eventually come to rest, it will want to rest here, just straight down, being pulled by gravity. But when it swings down, its momentum takes it past that point, and it swings past. And this is actually what happens, and you'll see this in both of these ion movements, where it overshoots the 0 position. And so, sodiums are flooded in. Now, once we get to about plus 30, these sodium-gated, voltage-gated sodium channels shut, okay? And therefore, sodium is unable to come in. It's at this point that potassium voltage-gated channels open. And potassium now can flood out down its concentration gradient and an electrochemical gradient, and we see this point here, and we call this repolarization. The sodium ions flooding in from B to D here, this C, is depolarization, because the membrane was polarized at resting potential, and now it's been depolarized, and now when the potassium ions rush out here, we have repolarization. And once again, we have now suddenly a situation where with potassium plus ions flooding out, this becomes more negative on the inside. So we go from plus 30 to plus 20 to plus 10 to 0 to minus 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. Now, bearing in mind our membrane potential was minus 70 at resting potential, you might think that 0 in terms of the resting potential is minus 70, but it goes past minus 70. And this we call hyperpolarization. And this is where the potassium ions, instead of stopping at minus 70, they overshoot their mark and go lower than the minus 70. This then is restored by the sodium-potassium ATPase pump and the potassium leach channels again, which I have to say, and it's an important point, have always been going. So although the action potential is dependent upon these two channels, the voltage-gated channels, the sodium-potassium pump is always going, and the potassium leach channel is always going. But it's these two that allow floods in and floods out. And so we can actually use this information that we've got now to see the shape of this. But before we do that, I just want to mention a couple of things. In our neuron, which I've drawn a very specific part of the membrane here, but if we just talk about a much bigger part, we start off with plus, minus, plus, minus, plus, minus, plus, minus. This is the resting potential. Okay? And there's a minus 70 millivolt across them. When the sodium ions flood in, the reason that we get what we call a wave depolarization, the reason that this doesn't happen just once in this section of the membrane and then stop, is that, you remember that I told you that these voltage-gated sodium channels would open once a threshold potential was reached of, say, around minus 60, minus 55. As these pluses come in, they diffuse laterally. And by diffusing laterally, they make this section, this next section, more positive. And so this will get to the threshold potential of about minus 60. And then this will cause depolarization of this section. And then pluses that come in will diffuse to the next part, and it will cause almost like a chain reaction, like dominoes, of these voltage-gated channels opening due to the drift by diffusion of these positive sodium ions. And we call that a wave of depolarization. And it's literally like dominoes. Now, neurons and the firing of neurons is a very, very precise and exact process. If we are talking about movements which are very, very finely tuned, you need to know that your neurons are very specifically acting. And for this reason, we don't want neurons misfiring. If there's a stimulus which causes an action potential, we want that stimulus to cause that action potential. We don't want contamination of that stimulus causing an action potential, and then the same stimulus, which is no longer relevant, causing an action potential again. And I've just drawn here a picture of plus ions diffusing to this direction. Okay, so to the right. I didn't show them diffusing this way, but of course they do. They will diffuse in a direction which is a lower concentration, down a concentration gradient. And we've got a problem here, because we need to look at this part of the graph and work out that if in fact we've got a system where once these sodium ion channels have opened and then closed, and then once these have opened and then closed, we then use this pump and this leach channel to reset the membrane potential, then this resetting of everything could be contaminated, if this is a voltage-gated channel for sodium, by the return journey here, for example. Because if this opens at plus 60, then it's going to be open here, and the sodium ions will be able to flood in again. And so we've got a very, very clever situation here. And it's this. After the sodium plus channel shuts, which is here, so sodium ions have flooded in, they've made the potential difference positive, say plus 30. At D, the voltage gated channels shut for sodium, instead of just shutting, they also become inactive. And that means that it's effectively putting them out of commission. So they don't just shut due to the voltage, they become not working, they're inactive. And this is important because it allows this whole process to reset without contamination of this scenario I talked about here. Because if there was a point at which, through this being reset while it was still active, the positive ions from elsewhere in the membrane diffused back in this direction, then a stimulus that went that way could also go that way. And that's a real problem for us. We need to be what we call unidirectional, one direction, and we need it to be accurate and according to the stimulus we get at the time the stimulus happens. And so the reason that the action potential doesn't go back from whence it came is that these voltage gated channels become inactive, and therefore even if the voltage which would activate them was reached, it doesn't happen because they've become inactive for a while. And this is very important here, because from this time here to the time we get back to the resting potential, we call the refractory period. And this is the point at which no further action potentials could in fact stimulate an action potential, because we're resetting it in order to make sure it doesn't go backwards. We're resetting everything and we're having a fresh start. And so the time scale that they think that this would all take is about a millisecond. All right? And so after you've had a stimulation, there is a time between that stimulation and the next stimulation that could happen. And that time is when everything's fired and everything's been reset and these voltage gated channels are inactive, so there can be no contamination from the ions leaking backwards down into concentration gradient. And this refractory period means that only a certain number of action potentials can happen in a time. And they think it's about 1 millisecond. So that is the ionic movements of an action potential, very much dominated by the voltage gated channels, and then this last hyperpolarization at F, hyperpolarization, is reset by the continued pumping and leaking of proteins 1 and 2. And if you saw my resting potential video, you'll know what they do. So that is an action potential in terms of ions. Now, the last thing to say about this is that as well